Hello, my name is Jeremy Burke from King's College London. I currently work on the PGCE Mathematics at King's, and prior to that I was a teacher in school for many years in 4 different London schools, both as a teacher, head of department, and then later as a senior manager. Today we're going to look at planning lesson sequences. We're talking about planning the sequence as perhaps the most important thing that we can do as teachers, other than be in front of the pupils themselves. Thinking about planning and thinking about the topic that we're going to teach, we'll deal with a whole range of problems before they ever arrive. So we are concerned to try and address these as best as we can before we go into the lesson. The first problem, oddly enough, is the topic itself. So although we, as maths teachers, in our own ways have a good expertise in mathematics, we need to be concerned that the mathematics that we know is made in a form that the pupils can understand. To try and describe how we can structure our planning, we are using a definition called map, narrative and orientation. And I want to take you through these 3 areas of planning in order to try and give a structure and an idea for how we can plan effectively for pupils' understanding. So here, learning is described using the metaphor of traversing a terrain of new knowledge. So as pupils are inducted into a particular practice or an area of mathematics, then it is like travelling a new land in which they are finding out new things. And as they pass through that land, they're going to come across new ideas and new concepts which they have to understand and gradually start to make their own. So our starting point for this journey is to define a map. And a map outlines the practice into which learners are to be inducted. So our metaphor of a map will contain a number of places to visit, or in this case topics or ideas that we want to introduce to pupils. The map is based on your thinking about the mathematics or the mathematical topic that you want to introduce. Continuing the metaphor, the narrative is the route through the terrain. It's the story being told, it's the journey that you want your pupils to travel in order to come to understand the topic that you are introducing to them. It's the order of events. And then to aid the narrative, to aid the navigation of the terrain, we talk about orienting activities which enable pupils to have some sense of where they are and some sense indeed of where they're going. So these 3 aspects, map, narrative and orientation, we are using to structure our introduction to lesson planning. So let's look at map. Map, I would argue, is the key to effective planning. And it's something which you have to make clear to yourself. So as a teacher, you have to be very clear what you are talking about in your lesson. You have to be very clear how you can explain what it is that you are introducing pupils to. You have to be able to decide on the mathematics that you're teaching and the way that it works for you. It's your explanation, you have to understand it. The starting point for developing a map is to ask yourself the question, what am I talking about? What does this mean? So, for example, if we were to look at linear functions, then we would ask ourselves the question, what is a function? And we would need to be able to define what we mean by a function. And then we would have to ask ourselves the question, what is linear? What is it about a function that is linear? And then be able to explain what we mean by linear to someone who doesn't understand what linear is, or in this particular case will not have met it before. So we are going to have to think through what appears to be very basic and simple maths in a great degree of detail, because the people to whom we're talking won't have met it before. I want to draw on an example, and I'm going to use for this example teaching area. So to define a map on teaching area, our first question would be, what is area? Now, we might think of area as being a space, and this is often the way people describe it, but I think we're better off if we consider area as a surface, and then that enables us to get a good description of what we're talking. Subsequent questions might include, how is area calculated? What are the differences in teaching the areas of triangles or quadrilaterals or pentagons, or even circles or irregular shapes? We might also consider how area topics in the curriculum are related. So we can take a topic and not just have it as a standalone item, but as something that is part of the structure of mathematics. To define our narrative, we now need to decide on the story that will be told. This will inevitably vary between groups. There is no fixed, correct narrative. A narrative is simply something that will work for you, or will work for the pupils that you're going to teach. And as you understand them, so you will have an idea of what it is that will work with them. So one narrative in our example of area might be to build up a mathematical argument for working out simple areas and then moving to working out more complex shapes. If we then move on to orienting activities, this will depend in no small parts on the narrative that we have selected. And so we will be giving some activities to pupils to try and understand the points of the argument that we're developing. So we might start with giving pupils an area of a given rectangle to calculate. Now here, they might do this by counting squares, in which case you would move towards a generalization of length times breadth as a way of calculating this. Alternatively, if pupils arrive with length times breadth as a way to calculate an area, then you might ask them, well, how do you know that works? Either way, we want to make sure that we've got a good grasp of what's going on when we use length times breadth to calculate area of a rectangle. From there, we might move on, say, to find the area of a given parallelogram. And here, we can look at the parallel shear that takes a rectangle to a parallelogram, or back from a parallelogram to a rectangle. We might also introduce a rather interesting proof that parallel shears of a rectangle conserve area. And then we can move to other shapes and so on. So orienting would consist of a range of activities. Now at this point I want to give you an orienting activity, and I'm going to ask you to think about these things. So firstly, I would ask you to define what you mean by area. Secondly, think how area is calculated. Is there a rule to cover area computations for all shapes? Thirdly, link as many curriculum areas or topics as you can that index area. So how many different parts of mathematics are making use of area? And we might consider, for example, quadratics as one example of this. Fourthly, design a narrative and consider which activities you would use in order to teach this topic in mathematics. If you want to look at this further, then I would recommend that you read an article I wrote with Rebecca Warren, which will be printed in Mathematics Teaching late in 2011. So in conclusion, we have looked at MNO, Maps, Narrative and Orientation, as a structure for designing lesson sequences and choosing activities for pupils to engage with. So for effective planning, you need to give time to considering the mathematics that you are going to teach. Topics that appear obvious are often the hardest to teach because they are obvious to you, but they are not, unfortunately, obvious to the pupils that you are going to try and induct this with. Topics that appear obvious are often the hardest, and you need to make it obvious to the pupils who will not have met this before, so you have to think quite a lot about how you're going to manage that explanation. Look for curriculum connections. To what other areas of the curriculum does your topic relate? Where will your topic move on to? Design a narrative to cover a number of lessons, and this becomes your sequence plan. And your narrative underpins where you are going to direct pupils when you consider assessment for learning. So when you give guidance for their next steps, then you'll refer to your narrative as the direction in which you're going to take children. And then finally, consider what it is that you are going to ask your pupils to do.